Hey, what's going on, you guys? Hope you're all doing amazingly well. In this video series, we're going to be covering quick topics about mixing that you can use in your music productions. In this case, we're looking at how do you find harsh offensive frequencies and get rid of them out of the sounds that you have in your music. So harsh offensive frequencies can appear in all different kinds of instruments. I find they're very common in anything that uses a distortion element or just generally has brighter frequencies in it. It's typically synthesizers, guitars, maybe a bright vocal. But a lot of people are wondering, how do you find those frequencies and know to get rid of them? So how do we find these frequencies? Let's take a listen to the sound and get right into it. Okay, so there's the sound, and right off the bat, it has distortion in it. It is a bit harsh to the ears. It's just a general sense of unpleasantness. And how we find those frequencies, there's a couple of techniques you can try. So the first one might surprise you. Here I have a limiter set up. And, when we're making sample packs, which is what I do, a lot of times all the time, we limit every sound that we export. So if I make a sample, I'm going to export it at unity gain at 0. So I'm going to limit everything that exports. So it's a common technique for sample pack creators, but for you, if you're mixing, if you're having trouble seeing where or hearing where those frequencies are that are bothering you, I would grab a limiter and beef up the gain. Because what this does is it brings up it crushes the dynamic range of the sound, which makes it easier to hear where those offensive frequencies are. You can hear a lot of the problems with a sound when you actually limit it and you bring up the gain like that. So that's what I'm doing here. So let's take another listen to the sound. Okay, so you might be able to hear some of those offensive frequencies now a little bit better. And this brings me into the next idea, which is that when you use an EQ, if you're trying to fix something, you should try to take away. There's a lot of debate about whether you add with an EQ or take away. In my opinion, this is just my opinion, but when you're trying to fix a sound, the first step is to take something away. Try to find the thing that is getting in the way of your sound being the best it can be. If you want to add frequencies, you obviously can. And it's typical to add frequencies if you're grabbing an EQ that has more of a character or a color to it, and you want to add those harmonics to the sound, then you are sort of grabbing an EQ to add. But in this case, you can see I'm just taking things away. And some of those things are very obvious. I have a high pass filter. And then we can see here in these upper mids, these are where the problem areas are. So let's take a listen to the sound, and then we can isolate those frequencies with this headphone tool that FabFilter provides. So let's take a listen. Okay, so two things right off the bat. You could hear when I turned on the EQ, the sound became somewhat darker as I took away these upper mid frequencies. And when I isolated those frequencies, you could hear there's a general sense of unpleasantness about those frequency ranges, or they're a bit harsh to the ears. So by taking them away, I'm using a much more narrow Q to avoid phase issues. That's very normal to do. When you're being surgical, they call it being surgical with an EQ, you're going to use a tighter Q. That's getting rid of those frequencies. And I also take a little bit of 220 away. Now, you can hear it towards the end of the loop. Those bottom notes have their principal or their primary harmonic around that range. I just thought it was being a little bit overwhelming there. So sometimes by taking a small cut in the lower mids, that can actually help you with lower notes on a keyboard or even a piano that are a little bit overwhelming. And this is a very static way of sort of getting rid of those frequencies. If you don't have a EQ that can isolate the frequencies, you just do the opposite. You push the frequency band up to help you find the most unpleasant areas and sort of scan through. And then once you find them, then you cut them. So that's a typical way to find harsh frequencies. Now, to jump into something else here, I'm going to bring up, this is basically a multi-band compressor. So just how we kind of talked about using an EQ, this is more of a static form of processing where no matter what the sound is doing, it's going to be taking away using these parameters, right? So as the sound plays, this EQ stays the same. And that's not a big deal. I mean, that's a great way to focus on a sound, but some things actually focus more on the dynamics. So what I have here is, this is called C6 by Waves. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually taking a very specific frequency band. In this case, it's the mid-range. It's not the upper mids, it's the mid-mids, I call them, the mid-mids. And I'm actually dynamically reducing them. So what this is going to do is it's going to pick a frequency band, and it's this one right here. So I'm going to solo this. All these other ones are set to 0, so they're not doing anything. And this is going to now isolate the mid-mids and control some of those mid-mids so that it's not as overwhelming to the sound. Because while the high mids were a little bit harsh, I also found the more medium mids, you can see here, this is from about 100 hertz it's about 1700 hertz. So this is really like the bulk of the mid-range and the lower mid-range. Those frequencies were kind of a little too dynamic. So now this is sort of like where we talk about EQ as a static thing. A multi-band processor is a very dynamic thing, but it can focus on certain frequency ranges like an EQ does. And that's what this is doing here. So there's the mid-mids, as I call them. Now you're going to notice when I turn this on and off, you're going to hear generally like things become a bit clearer and more controlled. And that's the mid-range frequencies being specifically put into more control dynamically. So let's A/B this. So there's a little more clarity there when we control those mids. Sometimes with guitar players, they call this scooping the mids, as if you're scooping them out. And that can give you a nice sort of clarity to the sound. And then the final thing I'm doing is the actual compression. So you looked at a multi-band compressor where I focus on one frequency. Now I'm just compressing the signal. So I did corrective EQ. I did a little multi-band processing on the problem areas. And now I'm taking a compressor, and this is just handling the whole frequency of the sound. I got two different compressors. This one here is rather transparent, and it's only doing 2-to-1 ratio. It's pretty light. And this here is an opto compressor. This is really, very simple. Peak reduction and gain. So that's basically it. You can obviously use the dry wet feature, which is a nice modern twist on this. But basically, look at the meters and see what they're doing. So not a whole lot. You can see here, right here, this got up to 1 decibel gain reduction. This got up to about 0.5 decibel. So I'm not being very aggressive with it. Not at all. And that's basically what I wanted. I wanted dynamic sound. So I'm just controlling, and it's controlling the notes in the mid-range that get a little out of hand. Those are still touching those compressors. So I control them a little bit here, and I control them more here. But this is generally handling the whole sound as a unit. And then, of course, it goes into the limiter, which is bringing it up to unity gain. This is the typical workflow that I use when I create sample packs. And yeah, hopefully you got something out of this video, learned a little bit about mixing, how to use certain plugins, how to use EQs and multiband compressors and what they're for. And yeah, if you like this video, get something out of it, hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this. And there'll be many more videos in the future. So have fun making music. I'll see you around.